Every cabin keeps a secret. Some are never meant to be found. But on the morning of April 12, 1981, in the quiet mountains of Northern California, one young girl opened a door and discovered that nightmares don't just live in dreams. They wait in living rooms, they hide behind locked doors, and sometimes they're protected by the very people sworn to expose them. This is a true story. This is the Keddie cabin case. The year is 1981. Ronald Reagan has just taken office. MTV is about to launch. The country is caught between the fading echoes of the 70s and the uncertain promise of a new decade. And in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, in a place called Keddie, a small resort community is clinging to survival. Keddie isn't much. A collection of aging cabins scattered among the pines, a general store, a post office, and not much else. It was built decades earlier as a railroad town, a place where loggers and their families could find cheap housing and mountain air. By 1981, it's become a refuge for those who can't quite make it anywhere else. Single mothers, drifters, people starting over or running from something they'd rather not name. Glenna Sue Sharp is one of those people. She's 36 years old, recently separated from her husband James, and trying to build a new life for herself and her 5 children. Sue is described by those who knew her as kind, resilient, a woman doing her best in circumstances that would break most people. She's moved her family from Connecticut to California, chasing the promise of a fresh start. And in late 1980, they settle into Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. It's not much, this cabin. 2 bedrooms, a small living room, a kitchen. The walls are thin. The neighbors are close, but it's hers and it's home. Sue's children are Sheila, 14 years old, and the oldest daughter, John, 15 and protective of his younger siblings, Tina, 12 and full of life, Rick, 10, and Greg, just 5 years old. They're a tight family, bound together by circumstances and love in equal measure. In a place like Keddie, you learn to rely on the people closest to you. You learn that family is everything, and on the night of April 11th, 1981, that truth becomes both salvation and curse. That evening unfolds like any other. Sheila, the oldest daughter, asks her mother if she can sleep over at a friend's house across the street. The friend lives in Cabin 27, just a short walk through the trees. Sue says yes. It's a small community. Everyone knows everyone. What could possibly go wrong? Sheila leaves, excited for a night of teenage conversation and escape from her younger brothers. She has no idea that she'll never see her mother alive again. Back in Cabin 28, Sue settles in for the evening with her children. John has a friend over, a 17-year-old named Dana Hall Wingate. Dana is a good kid, known around Keddie as polite and helpful. He spent time with the Sharp family before, and tonight he's just hanging out with John, probably talking about girls and cars and all the things teenage boys discuss when they think the world belongs to them. The younger boys, Rick and Greg, have their own friend over, 12-year-old Justin Eason. The 3 of them retreat to one of the bedrooms, absorbed in whatever games and adventures occupy the minds of children. Tina, the middle daughter, is there too, 12 years old, perched on that uncertain edge between childhood and adolescence. She's in the cabin that night, in the living room with her mother, her brother, and Dana. We don't know exactly what they were doing. Watching television, perhaps, talking, existing in that casual, unremarkable way that families do when they have no reason to expect that existence to end. Somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock that evening, there's a knock at the door. Or maybe the door just opens. Accounts vary, as they always do when memory and trauma intersect. What we know is this. 2 men arrive at Cabin 28. Their names are Martin Smart and John Bubede, though most people call him Bo. Martin lives just 2 cabins away in Cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn and their children. Bo is staying with the Smarts, a house guest with a questionable past and connections that stretch all the way to organized crime in Chicago. These aren't strangers. In a place like Keddie, there are no strangers. These are neighbors. And that makes what happens next so much worse. According to later statements, Martin and Bo stopped by Cabin 28 to invite Sue to join them at a local establishment called the Backdoor Bar. Sue apparently declined. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she didn't want to leave her children. Maybe something in her gut told her that these men, despite being neighbors, weren't people she wanted to spend her evening with. We'll never know her reasoning because Sue Sharp never got the chance to tell anyone. What we do know is that at some point, after that invitation was declined, violence came to Cabin 28, and it came with a fury that defies rational explanation. The attack, when it begins, is swift and overwhelming. Sue, John, and Dana are in the living room. We can imagine the confusion, the sudden shift from mundane evening to incomprehensible terror. There's no time to run, no time to scream loud enough or long enough to bring help. The assailants bring weapons. A hammer, described later as having a blue handle and a claw on one end. Knives, at least 2 of them. And fists and rage and something darker than simple violence. This isn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing of significant value is taken. This isn't a random act by a stranger passing through. This is personal. This is fury made manifest. This is overkill. I need to pause here and acknowledge something. What happened in that cabin over the next hours is almost too terrible to fully describe. YouTube's policies and basic human decency prevent me from detailing every wound, every act of brutality inflicted on Sue, John, and Dana. But you need to understand the scope of what occurred, because it tells us something crucial about who did this and why. These weren't clinical eliminations. These weren't quick, efficient acts meant simply to end life. These were punishments, these were statements. And the evidence left behind suggests something even more disturbing, something that makes the stomach turn and the mind recoil. Sue is bound with electrical cord and medical tape. Her hands are restrained. Her mouth is gagged with a blue bandana and her own undergarments, held in place with more tape. She's partially undressed from the waist down. The implications hang in the air like smoke, unspoken but undeniable. She's stabbed in the chest and throat with such force that the blade passes through her larynx and nicks her spine. Her head bears an imprint consistent with the butt of a BB gun, a Daisy 880 model, pressed against her skull with enough force to leave its mark in her skin. Sue Sharp, mother of 5, dies on the floor of her living room while her youngest children sleep in the next room. John, 15 years old and trying to protect his mother, his friend, trying to do what a young man believes he should do when violence invades his home, has his throat cut. I won't detail the wound further than that. It's enough to know that John died trying to be brave in a situation where bravery meant nothing against the overwhelming force that descended on his family that night. Dana Wingate, 17 years old and in the wrong place at the worst possible time, suffers multiple blows to the head from a blunt object, almost certainly the hammer. He's also manually strangled, choked, until his body gives up its fight for air. The medical examiner will later determine that asphyxiation is the cause of his passing, that he essentially suffocated while his skull fractured under repeated impacts. Dana dies beside his friend, and one has to wonder in those final moments what thoughts passed through his mind. Did he think of his own family? Did he understand why this was happening? Or was there only confusion and pain and the desperate fading hope that someone would stop this? The living room of Cabin 28 becomes a scene that will haunt everyone who sees it. Blood on the walls, blood on the ceiling, blood on the doors and the back steps leading outside. Spatter patterns that tell the story of struggle and violence in a language that doesn't require words. 2 knives are recovered at the scene, both covered in blood. A hammer, presumably the weapon used on Dana and Sue, is missing. And here's what's particularly telling. Whoever did this walked away covered in blood. There's no way to inflict this level of trauma without being drenched in it. Yet no bloody clothing is ever found. No trail of blood leads away from the cabin into the woods or toward another residence. The perpetrators cleaned themselves somehow, changed their clothes somehow, disposed of the evidence somehow. And they did it in a small community where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep and strangers are immediately noticed. Think about what that means. Think about the planning, the knowledge of the area, the access to resources necessary to commit an act of this magnitude, and then simply vanish into the night. In the bedroom adjacent to the living room, 3 children sleep through it all. Rick Sharp, 10 years old. Greg Sharp, 5 years old. Justin Eason, 12 years old and visiting for the night. How is this possible? How do 3 boys, separated from unimaginable violence by only a wall and a door, hear nothing? Or if they heard something, why didn't they emerge? Why didn't they call for help? This question will haunt investigators and armchair detectives for decades. Some will suggest the children were drugged, given something to keep them unconscious. Others will point to the simple, terrible psychology of trauma, the way a child's mind can shut down and retreat inward when confronted with sounds and situations it cannot process. We don't know. The boys, when interviewed later, offer confused and sometimes contradictory accounts. Justin in particular will struggle with his memories of that night, later recalling fragments, images, feelings that may or may not be reliable. What we do know is that these 3 children survived the night physically unharmed. And in a crime this brutal, that's not an accident. That's a choice. Whoever committed these acts could have entered that bedroom. They could have eliminated all witnesses. They chose not to. Why? Perhaps they knew the children. Perhaps they believed the children hadn't seen anything that could identify them. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest possibility, they knew that leaving those children alive to cope with the aftermath was a cruelty all its own. But there are 4 children in cabin 28 that night, not 3. Tina Sharp, 12 years old, is in the living room when the violence begins. And when morning comes, when the scene is finally discovered, Tina is gone. Not deceased alongside her mother and brother, not hiding in a closet or under a bed. Gone, vanished, taken. The implications are staggering. Someone removed a 12-year-old girl from a scene of mass violence. Someone took her somewhere. And the question that will hang over this case for 3 long years is simple and terrible. Why? If you're listening to this and feeling that particular heaviness that comes from confronting true darkness, I want you to do something. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me if cases like this one make you question what you thought you knew about justice, about safety, about the institutions we trust to protect us. Share this video with someone who needs to know that the world isn't always what we pretend it is. Because the story we're telling here isn't just about what happened in cabin 28, it's about what happened after. And that, in many ways, is even worse. The morning of April 12, 1981 arrives with all the casual indifference that mornings always bring. The sun rises over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Birds sing in the pines. The air is cold and clean and gives no indication that anything has changed, that 3 people have been taken from the world in the most violent way imaginable. Sheila Sharp wakes up at her friend's house in cabin 27. She's 14 years old. She spent the night talking and laughing and doing all the things teenage girls do when they're together. She has no idea that her life has already ended, that the person she was yesterday is gone, and the person she'll be forced to become is waiting for her across the street. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, Sheila walks back to cabin 28. She's probably thinking about breakfast, about her younger brothers, about the mundane concerns of a Sunday morning in a small mountain town. She opens the door, and she steps into hell. Try to imagine it. Try to put yourself in the mind of a 14-year-old girl who has just discovered her mother, her brother, and her brother's friend in the state I've described. Try to imagine the scream that must have torn from her throat, the way her legs must have given out, the absolute shattering of reality that occurs in a moment like that. Sheila runs from the cabin. She's screaming. She's crying. Neighbors hear her and come running. Within minutes, law enforcement is called. Within an hour, cabin 28 is swarming with deputies, investigators, photographers, and the grim machinery of a law enforcement response to a scene of violence. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office takes control of the investigation. The sheriff at that time is a man named Doug Thomas. Remember that name, we'll be coming back to it. The crime scene is documented, photographed, and processed according to the procedures of the day. Evidence is collected, statements are taken, the bodies are removed and transported for autopsy. And gradually, as the day wears on, a picture begins to emerge. Not a complete picture, never a complete picture, but enough of one to point in a particular direction. The first and most obvious question: where is Tina Sharp? She was in the cabin the night before. Her younger brothers confirm this. But she's not among the deceased, and she's not anywhere in Keddie. Her disappearance immediately elevates this from a local investigation to a federal matter. The FBI becomes involved, operating under the assumption that Tina has been abducted. Alerts go out. Searchers comb the woods around Keddie. Posters are distributed. And for 3 years, Tina Sharp's fate remains one of the great mysteries of the case. Her family clings to hope that maybe, somehow, she's alive somewhere, that she escaped, that she'll come home. But deep down, everyone knows. You don't take a child from a scene like that and let them live. Not if they've seen something. Not if they can identify you. The investigation moves quickly in those first days. Neighbors are interviewed. People who were in Keddie that night are asked about what they saw, what they heard, and certain names come up again and again. Martin Smart and John Boubede. The two men living in cabin 26, just 2 cabins away from the scene. Multiple witnesses placed them in the area that night. Some recall seeing them at the backdoor bar, the local establishment they'd invited Sue to join them at. Others remember seeing them return to cabin 26 in the early morning hours. And then there are the odd details, the things that don't quite make sense until you start putting the pieces together. Martin Smart, when questioned by investigators, volunteers an interesting piece of information. He mentions that a hammer has gone missing from his cabin, a claw hammer with a blue handle. He's not sure when it disappeared, but he thinks it might have been around the time of the incident. Why would someone bring this up unprompted? Why mention a missing hammer unless you're trying to establish an alibi? Unless you're trying to plant the seed that someone must have taken it from you without your knowledge. It's the kind of detail that seems helpful on the surface, but actually raises more questions than it answers. Martin also confirms that he and Bo stopped by cabin 28 around 9 o'clock on the evening of April 11th. They wanted to invite Sue to the bar. She declined. They left. That's the story. Simple, straightforward. Except that it places them at the scene during a critical window. It establishes opportunity, and when you combine opportunity with the other evidence that will emerge, the picture becomes clearer and more damning. Marilyn Smart, Martin's wife, provides her own account of that night. She was at the backdoor bar with her husband and Bo earlier in the evening. At some point, the two men left, saying they were going to invite Sue to join them. They returned to the bar later, and here's where Marilyn's statement becomes crucial. She notices that Martin and Bo are wearing different clothes. They're now dressed in matching 3-piece suits with sunglasses, clothing that strikes Marilyn as odd because neither man typically dresses that way. Later, she'll tell investigators that she believes at least some of the clothing belonged to Tina Sharp. Think about that. A mother and 2 teenage boys are found bound and deceased in their cabin, a 12-year-old girl is missing, and 2 men who live nearby show up at a bar wearing clothes that may have belonged to that missing girl, having changed out of whatever they were wearing earlier. What happened to the original clothes? Where did the suits come from? And why did they feel the need to change at all? The investigation also uncovers a second knife, this one found in a trash bin behind the Keddie General Store. It's covered in blood. The trash bin is located along a logical route someone might take walking from cabin 28 back toward cabin 26. Is it one of the weapons from the scene? Was it placed there deliberately? Did the investigators process it properly, check it for fingerprints, connect it definitively to the crime? These questions will never be adequately answered because, as we'll see, the handling of evidence in this case is a disaster of historic proportions. In those first weeks, Martin Smart and Bo Boubede are questioned multiple times. They're given polygraph tests. Martin later claims he beat his polygraph, that he lied and the machine didn't catch it, that those things are easy to beat. Bo's results are unclear. Both men maintain their innocence. Both men have explanations for everything. And critically, both men are allowed to leave Keddie. Martin moves to Nevada. Bo heads to Chicago. They're not arrested, they're not held, they're not kept under surveillance. The primary suspects in a quadruple case are simply permitted to walk away and start new lives elsewhere. Why? This is where we need to talk about Sheriff Doug Thomas, because his relationship with Martin Smart is, to put it mildly, problematic. Thomas later admits that he and Smart were friends, that Smart spent time riding along with him during patrols, that Smart came to him for advice about his troubled marriage with Marilyn. Thomas describes them as great pals. He also reveals something even more striking. Before the Sharp family moved into cabin 28, Doug Thomas himself lived there. He and Martin Smart were neighbors, and according to multiple accounts, drinking buddies who spent considerable time together at the backdoor bar. Now imagine you're investigating the most serious case of your career. 4 people are gone, one of them a child who remains missing, and your primary suspect is your friend. Someone you've shared drinks with, someone you've confided in, someone who knows you and you know him. What do you do? The ethical answer, the answer that preserves the integrity of the investigation, is to recuse yourself immediately. Step aside, let someone else handle it. But Doug Thomas doesn't do that. He remains in charge of the investigation, and under his watch, Martin Smart and Bobo Bede slip through every net that should have held them. If this feels wrong to you, if your sense of justice is screaming that something here doesn't add up, you're not alone. Take a moment and hit that like button. Help us reach our goal. Because cases like this need attention. They need scrutiny. They need people willing to ask the questions that the original investigators either couldn't or wouldn't ask. The months pass. Summer comes to the Sierra Nevada mountains, then autumn, then winter. The investigation continues in theory, but in practice it stalls. Leads aren't followed up. Evidence sits unprocessed. The Sharp family, those who survived, try to piece their lives back together while living with an impossible void. Sheila, the 14-year-old girl who discovered the scene, carries a burden no child should bear. Rick and Greg, the younger brothers who were in the cabin that night, struggle with questions they can't answer and memories that may or may not be real. And somewhere out there, whether in a shallow grave or scattered across the forest floor, Tina Sharp waits to be found. 3 years. For 3 years, the question of what happened to Tina hangs over everything. The FBI keeps her case open as a possible abduction. Age-progressed photos are created and distributed, showing what Tina might look like at 13, at 14, at 15. Her family marks birthdays and holidays with her absence like an open wound. And then in April of 1984, exactly 3 years to the day after the events at Cabin 28, a man foraging for bottles in the woods near a place called Camp 18 in Butte County, about 62 miles from Keddie, makes a discovery. It's a small section of human skull, bones, fragments. He contacts the authorities. The remains are collected and analyzed. Dental records are compared. And finally, definitively, Tina Sharp is identified. She's been deceased since 1981, almost certainly since the night of April 11th or early morning of April 12th. She's been lying in those woods for 3 years, while her family waited and hoped and grieved without closure. But here's the strange part, the part that will never quite make sense. Before the official identification is confirmed, before the dental records have been compared, and the family notified, someone calls 911 and reports that the remains found near Camp 18 belong to Tina Sharp. An anonymous caller, somehow aware of details that haven't been released publicly, correctly identifying a discovery that hasn't yet been officially confirmed. Who made that call? How did they know? And why did they remain anonymous? Was it guilt? Was it someone involved in the case trying to point investigators in a particular direction without implicating themselves? Or was it something more sinister? A message from someone who wanted the world to know that they'd gotten away with it? The discovery of Tina's remains should have reinvigorated the investigation, should have brought renewed focus and resources. But by 1984, the case has already gone cold in the ways that matter most. Martin Smart is living in Nevada. Bobo Bede is in Chicago, running scams and staying one step ahead of various legal troubles. Sheriff Doug Thomas is still overseeing the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. And the evidence, the crucial physical evidence that might have solved this case if it had been properly handled from the beginning, is sitting in storage, degrading, being contaminated, or in some cases simply lost. Years pass. The Keddie case becomes one of those regional mysteries that true crime enthusiasts discuss in forums and blog posts. Sheila Sharp, now an adult, tries to build a life while living with the trauma of what she saw. She becomes an advocate for other survivors, speaking publicly about her experience and her frustration with a system that failed her family so completely. The other Sharp children scatter, each dealing with their grief and trauma in private ways. And in the background, always in the background, the question persists. Why hasn't anyone been arrested? Why, when so much seems to point in one direction, has justice remained perpetually out of reach? In the year 2000, Martin Smart passes away from cancer. He's never been charged with any crime related to the Keddie case. He dies, as far as the law is concerned, an innocent man. And with his passing, the possibility of traditional justice, of a trial and a conviction and a sentence begins to slip away. Because even if someone finally decides to take the case seriously, even if evidence is properly analyzed and connections are finally made, you can't prosecute a deceased person. You can't put a dead man in prison. The window closes. The opportunity is lost. And all that remains are the lingering questions and the weight of what might have been if only someone had acted sooner. But stories like this have a way of refusing to stay buried. Truth, even when it's suppressed or ignored or deliberately covered up, has a stubborn persistence. And in 2013, more than 3 decades after the events at Cabin 28, something changes. Plumas County has a new sheriff, a man named Greg Hagwood. Hagwood looks at the Keddie case, at the evidence that's been moldering in storage for decades, at the witness statements that were never properly followed up, at the obvious suspects who were allowed to simply walk away, and he makes a decision. He's going to reopen this case. He's going to bring in fresh eyes, and he's going to do what should have been done in 1981, actually investigate. Hagwood brings in a retired detective named Mike Gamberg. Gamberg is experienced, methodical, and crucially, he has no personal connections to anyone involved in the original investigation. He has no reason to protect anyone, no friendships to preserve, no political considerations to navigate. He's just a detective looking at evidence, and what he finds is shocking even to someone who's seen the worst of human nature. The evidence storage is a nightmare. Items that should have been carefully preserved, catalogued, and maintained are instead jumbled together, contaminated, or missing entirely. A freezer that was supposed to keep biological evidence viable has been turned off at some point, ruining anything it contained. Crucial items have never been properly logged, and here's the most damning discovery. An envelope containing information about the anonymous 911 call identifying Tina's remains has been sitting in the case file for 30 years completely unopened. No one ever bothered to look at it. No one thought it might be important that someone knew details about Tina's fate before those details were public knowledge. Gamberg's assessment of the original investigation is blunt and damning. You could take someone just coming out of the academy, he says, and they'd have done a better job, and this isn't just incompetence. This is negligence on a scale that suggests either profound dysfunction or deliberate sabotage. And the more Gamberg digs, the more he leans toward the latter explanation. He interviews witnesses who were never properly questioned in 1981. He finds people who remember seeing Martin Smart burning clothing on the morning of April 12, 1981. He uncovers statements from individuals who heard Smart make incriminating remarks but were never asked to provide formal testimony. And he learns about something that should have broken the case wide open 4 decades earlier, a confession. In May of 1981, just weeks after the events at Cabin 28, Martin Smart apparently visited a therapist at the Veterans Administration facility in Reno, Nevada. During that session, according to the therapist's later account, Smart confessed to taking the lives of Sue and Tina Sharp. The therapist described Smart's demeanor during this confession as flat, emotionless, showing a 0 of affect when discussing Sue's passing. But when Tina's name came up, something changed. Smart became agitated. He explained that he had to eliminate Tina because she saw the whole thing. I couldn't have a witness. The therapist, recognizing the gravity of what he was hearing, advised Smart to turn himself in to authorities. Smart's response? He smiled. The therapist reported this confession to the authorities. He documented it. He did what he was ethically and legally obligated to do. And the Department of Justice dismissed it as hearsay. They took a direct confession to a double homicide from a primary suspect in a quadruple case and decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Why? This is the question that haunts every serious examination of the Keddie case. Why would evidence this significant be ignored? What possible justification could there be for not immediately bringing Martin Smart in for intensive questioning based on this confession alone? Some have speculated that organized crime connections explain the lack of action. Beau Boubaid, Martin's friend and alleged accomplice, had ties to criminal organizations in Chicago. Some have suggested that Keddie, despite being a small mountain community, was a waypoint for various illegal activities, including narcotics distribution. The fact that the Department of Justice sent organized crime specialists to Keddie via helicopter on the morning of April 12, 1981, rather than standard homicide investigators, suggests that someone believed this case had dimensions beyond a simple domestic incident. But if that's true, if this case intersects with larger criminal enterprises or even federal operations, what does that mean for the possibility of justice? How deep does the cover-up go? And who benefited from ensuring that Martin Smart and Bo Bubede were never properly held accountable? These are the questions we ask in the dark hours. These are the puzzles that don't have satisfying answers. And if you're still listening, if you've made it this far into the file with me, then you understand what drives people like Sheriff Hagwood and Detective Gamberg. It's not just about solving a case, it's about restoring some measure of dignity to people who were failed by every system that should have protected them. I want you to share this video. Send it to someone who cares about justice, about accountability, about the way power can be misused and the consequences that follow. Because what happened in Keddie matters, not just for the Sharp family, but for everyone who trusts that when something terrible occurs, the right people will do the right things. The reinvestigation yields new evidence. In 2016, a man using a metal detector near Keddie discovers something in a pond. It's a claw hammer with a blue handle. It matches exactly the description of the hammer Martin Smart reported missing in April of 1981. The hammer is recovered and analyzed. It shows signs consistent with having been submerged for decades. But is it the weapon? Can it be definitively tied to the crime scene after 35 years of environmental exposure? These are questions that forensic experts will work to answer. Gamberg also focuses on the medical tape found at the scene, the tape used to bind Sue Sharp and gag her. In 1981, DNA analysis wasn't the sophisticated tool it is today. Samples were collected but not fully processed. In 2018, using modern techniques, Gamberg and his team analyzed DNA recovered from that tape, and they get a match. The DNA belongs to someone known to the investigation, someone who is still alive. Gamberg and Hagwood hold a press conference to announce this development. They're careful about what they say, aware of legal restrictions and the need to build a case that will hold up in court. But they make one thing clear. They know who was involved. They have evidence. And they believe that approximately 6 people played roles in either the actual violence or the subsequent cover-up and disposal of evidence. 6 people. Think about that. This isn't a lone wolf scenario. This isn't one disturbed individual acting on impulse. This is conspiracy. This is coordination. This is multiple people deciding that their own interests are more important than justice for Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp. Some of these people are deceased now. Martin Smart is gone, Bo Bubede is gone, but others are still alive. They're living somewhere, carrying the weight of what they did or what they helped hide, and they know that someone is watching, that the file has been reopened, that the secrets they thought they'd buried are rising to the surface. But here's the cruel reality. Knowing who did something and being able to prosecute them are two different things. The case is old. Memories have faded. Witnesses have passed away. Evidence has been compromised. And crucially, the main perpetrators are beyond the reach of earthly justice. Martin Smart died in 2000. Bo Bubede died in 1988. You can't put handcuffs on a ghost. You can't read rights to someone who's been in the ground for decades. The most that can be hoped for now is acknowledgement, an official declaration of what happened and who was responsible. Closure for the Sharp family, not through a trial but through the public recognition of truth. Sheriff Hagwood has stated clearly what he believes. It's my belief that there were more than 2 people who were involved in the totality of the crime, the disposal of the evidence, and the taking of the little girl. We're convinced that there are a handful of people that fit those roles who are still alive. Those people are living with their secrets. They're looking over their shoulders. They're wondering if today will be the day when a knock comes at the door and everything unravels. So why hasn't there been an arrest? Why, if the evidence is as strong as Hagwood and Gamberg suggest, hasn't someone been charged? The answer is complicated. It involves prosecutorial discretion, the difficulty of bringing a case this old to trial. The reality that without the main perpetrators available to testify or face justice, building a case against accomplices becomes extraordinarily difficult. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that some of those accomplices have connections that still protect them, that the same forces that allowed Martin Smart to walk away in 1981 are still operating in some form today. But even if no one ever stands trial, even if the Sharp family never gets to see someone sentenced for what was done to their loved ones, the truth has value. Knowing what happened, understanding the failures that allowed it to remain hidden for so long, acknowledging the names of those responsible, these things matter. They don't bring back the deceased. They don't erase trauma. But they affirm that the victims were real, that their lives had value, that what was done to them was wrong and recognized as wrong. There's another document that's worth mentioning, something that speaks to Martin Smart's state of mind in the weeks after April 11, 1981. On April 27th, just over 2 weeks after the incident at Cabin 28, Martin writes a letter to his estranged wife, Marilyn. He's in Nevada by this point, having left Keddie shortly after the events. The letter is written on flowery yellow stationery, a strangely delicate choice for the content it contains. In the letter, Martin writes, "I've paid the price of your love. And now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want? 4 people's lives, Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, Tina Sharp." Martin knew Tina was gone even though her remains wouldn't be found for another 3 years. He knew because he was there. He knew because he did it, or helped do it, or watched it happen. The letter isn't a clear confession in the legal sense. A defense attorney could argue it's metaphorical, emotional hyperbole from a man whose marriage is falling apart. But in context, given everything else we know, it reads like exactly what it appears to be. An admission of guilt wrapped in self-pity and resentment. Marilyn Smart saw that letter. She was aware of the questions surrounding her husband. She divorced him. She moved on with her life. And she's maintained a complicated silence over the years, sometimes cooperating with investigators, sometimes not, always carrying her own burden of knowledge and association with what happened. As we approach the end of this file, I want to step back and consider what the Keddie case really represents. On the surface, it's a story about violence and loss. 4 people taken from the world in a brutal manner, a family shattered, lives altered forever. But underneath that, it's a story about institutions, about the systems we create and trust to protect us, to pursue justice, to ensure that when terrible things happen, someone with authority and power will step in and make it right. And it's a story about what happens when those institutions fail, when the people running them are compromised or incompetent, or actively working against the interests of justice. Doug Thomas, the sheriff who was friends with the primary suspect, who lived in the same cabin where the crime occurred, who allowed that suspect to leave town and start a new life. He represents a particular kind of failure. It's not necessarily malicious, though it might be. It could simply be the failure of a man who couldn't separate his personal relationships from his professional duties, who couldn't see past his friendship to the evidence that friendship was with someone capable of monstrous acts. Or maybe it was something darker. Maybe there were reasons, financial or personal or related to activities we don't fully understand, that made Thomas willing to let this case go unsolved. The Department of Justice dismissing a confession as hearsay represents another kind of failure. It's institutional, bureaucratic, the kind of failure that happens when procedures and politics matter more than actual truth. Someone, somewhere, made the decision that Martin Smart's confession to a VA therapist wasn't worth pursuing. They had their reasons, no doubt, legal reasons, evidential reasons, but those reasons resulted in a man who admitted to taking 4 lives, never facing meaningful consequences for that admission. And then there's the failure of evidence handling, the freezer turned off, the unopened envelopes, the contaminated samples. This is the failure of neglect, of a system so overburdened or underfunded or indifferent that basic protocols aren't followed. Every piece of mishandled evidence is a door closed to justice. Every lost item is another question that will never be answered. The Keddie case could have been solved in 1981. The suspects were identified within days. They were questioned. Evidence was collected. A hammer matching the one used in the crime was reported missing by the primary suspect himself. Witnesses saw suspicious behavior. A confession was documented. Everything needed to bring charges and seek justice was available, but it didn't happen. And every year that passed made it less likely to happen until we arrived at the present moment where the best we can hope for is acknowledgement and truth without the satisfaction of legal accountability. For Sheila Sharp, now a woman in her 50s, the case will never truly be closed. She spent her entire adult life living with what she saw that morning, with the knowledge that the people who destroyed her family were never punished, that they lived free lives while she carried the weight of their crimes. She's advocated for changes in how cold cases are handled. She's spoken publicly about the failures of the original investigation. And she's waited, with more patience than anyone should have to muster, for someone in authority to do what should have been done 4 decades ago. The other surviving Sharp children have been more private in their grief. Rick, Greg, and the siblings who weren't in Cabin 28 that night have all had to forge lives in the shadow of unspeakable loss. They've had to answer questions about their family's tragedy. They've had to see their mothers' and siblings' names attached to one of California's most notorious unsolved cases, and they've had to live with the knowledge that somewhere out there, people who participated in what happened to their family have never faced consequences. This is what haunts me about cases like Keddie. It's not just the violence, though, that's horrible enough. It's the aftermath. It's the way injustice compounds itself over time, the way each failure leads to another, until you're left with a situation where everyone knows what happened, but no one can officially say it, where truth exists but justice doesn't, where the weight of what's unsaid crushes the people who deserve answers most. If cases like this one stay with you, if they make you question and wonder and feel that particular frustration that comes from confronting broken systems, then you understand why channels like this exist. We tell these stories not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remember, to honor the people whose lives were taken, to hold up a mirror to the failures that allowed their suffering to go unpunished, and to hope that by speaking these truths, by refusing to let them be forgotten, we might contribute in some small way to a world where such failures become less common. The Midnight File closes on the Keddie case without the satisfaction of resolution. Martin Smart and Bo Bubede are gone. The evidence is compromised. The investigation, despite renewed efforts, has produced knowledge without justice. But the story isn't over. Somewhere, people who helped cover up what happened are still alive. They're aging now, their lives winding down, and perhaps in the quiet moments, in the early morning hours when sleep won't come and the past presses close, they remember what they did. They remember the choices they made. They remember the family they helped destroy and the justice they helped deny. Truth has a strange quality. You can bury it, but it doesn't decompose. You can lock it away, but it doesn't fade. It waits. And sometimes, when enough time has passed and enough people have stopped paying attention, it rises to the surface again. The Keddie case rose. It's known now in a way it wasn't for decades. The Sharp family story has been told and retold, and the names of Martin Smart and John Bubede are forever associated with one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in American history. That's not the justice Sue Sharp deserved. It's not what John Sharp's young life was worth. It's not sufficient acknowledgement of Diana Wingate's innocence or Tina Sharp's stolen future. But it's something. It's the truth, spoken clearly, without equivocation. It's the recognition that what happened in Cabin 28 on the night of April 11th, 1981 was evil, that those who committed it were known, and that the system that should have stopped them failed completely. Every small town keeps secrets. Every community has its shadows, and sometimes those shadows stretch across decades, touching lives in ways that can't be undone. The Keddie Resort is still there, though Cabin 28 was torn down years ago. The place where Sue, John, Dana, and Tina spent their final moments no longer exists as a physical structure. But the memory remains. The story remains. And the questions, those stubborn, persistent questions about why justice failed and who benefited from that failure, those remain too. If you made it this far, if you've walked through this file with me from beginning to end, I thank you. These stories aren't easy. They require something from us as listeners, an emotional investment, a willingness to confront darkness without looking away. But that confrontation matters. It honors the people we've lost, and it keeps us vigilant against the forces, whether incompetence or malice, that allow such losses to go unanswered. The sun sets over the Sierra Nevada mountains the same way it did on April 11th, 1981. The trees grow, the seasons change, life continues with its relentless forward momentum. But in Keddie, in the memory of those who remember, in the work of investigators who refuse to give up, the file remains open. Not officially, perhaps, not in the sense that active prosecution is likely, but open in the way that matters most, in the collective refusal to forget, to move on, to let the story end without acknowledgement of what was done and who did it. Some mysteries are never fully solved. Some questions never get satisfying answers, but every question asked is an act of remembrance. Every story told is a refusal to let silence win. And every person who listens, who cares, who carries these truths forward into their own understanding of the world, participates in a kind of justice that exists outside courtrooms and legal proceedings. It's the justice of memory, the justice of truth acknowledged, the justice of refusing to let the forgotten stay forgotten. The midnight file closes on Keddie, but the story, like all true stories of consequence, doesn't end. It echoes, it resonates. It waits in the spaces between what we know and what we can prove, between what happened and what we can do about it. And somewhere in the quiet places where such things live, Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp are remembered not just as victims but as people who lived, who mattered, who deserved better than what they received. People whose story, for all its darkness and frustration and unanswered questions, still has the power to make us care, to make us question, to make us demand more from the systems we trust with our safety and our truth. That power, that persistent claim on our attention and conscience, is the only victory left to claim. And perhaps in the end, it's enough to keep the file open just a little longer, until the last person who remembers is gone, until the last question has been asked, until the weight of what happened finally settles into history, acknowledged and understood, even if never fully resolved. If cases like this one pull at something deep inside you, if you find yourself unable to look away from the darkness, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that button now, and if you can, help us reach just 20 likes on this video. 20 people willing to acknowledge that these stories matter, that these lives mattered, because what happened in Cabin 28 wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal. And the only way we honor the forgotten is by refusing to let them stay that way. Sleep well if you can. And remember, some doors once opened can never quite close again. This has been The Midnight File. Until next time.